Okay. All right. So we're ready to do the rest of chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians here. So I want to read it to you beginning in verse 7. He says, "But we have this treasure in earthen vessels." We've kind of covered that verse. "That the excellence of power may be of God and not of us." And Paul begins to talk about some of his sufferings. He says, "We are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We're perplexed, but not in despair. We're persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. For we who live are always delivered to death for Jesus' sake, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So then death is working in us, but life in you. And since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what is written, I believed, and therefore I spoke, we also believe, and therefore speak, knowing that he who raised up the Lord Jesus will also raise us up with Jesus, and will present us with you. For all things are for your sakes, that grace, having spread through the many, may cause thanksgiving to abound to the glory of God. Therefore we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Now, as I said in the previous lecture here, Paul begins the chapter by saying we don't lose heart. And we looked at some of the things that Paul did in order to not lose heart, and we specifically looked at these first 7 verses in the chapter here. But notice that Paul says the same thing in verse 16 rather. He says, even though, therefore, we do not lose heart. And so this is the theme that runs through the entire chapter, and it really even carries into chapter 5. And I think sometimes people, they see this section in verses 7 and following, and they think that Paul is talking about, he is in fact talking about his sufferings, but think maybe Paul's switched gears here. But really it's all part of that same thought about why we don't lose heart. And even into chapter 5, Paul's talking about why he doesn't lose heart. And I think we can summarize what Paul says about not losing heart. If I were going to summarize it in one word, that word would be focus. And so I titled this message, or this lesson, Finding Focus. Paul is able to persevere through all his trials because of where he puts his focus. And if we can find that same focus, we also can persevere through trials. So we want to see where Paul placed his focus. And those are the things we're going to look at in this passage. Where did Paul put his focus? And the first thing I want to point out is that Paul put his focus on the positive. These verses are full of contrasts between negative and positive things, right? We're hard pressed on every side. That's a negative. But not crushed. That's the positive. We're perplexed. That's the negative. But not in despair, right? That's the positive, and so on. Persecuted. That's the negative. But not forsaken. That's the positive. Struck down. That's the negative. But not destroyed. That's the positive. And he goes on. So it's full of these contrasts here. Now I want to point out here that focusing on the positive does not mean that you ignore the negative. Paul didn't do that. He lists a bunch of them, a bunch of negative things. It's not that Paul acted like those things didn't exist, or that he just ignored them, or that he just said we're not going to talk about those things. But for every negative he lists, he contrasts it with a greater positive. And so I just listed a bunch of those here. But he says, I've got a couple more that I didn't list here. He says, we're caring about death, but we're manifesting life. There's death working in us, but there's life working in you. The outward man is perishing, but the inward man is renewed day by day. The older I get, the more I can relate to that verse, that the outward man is perishing. It's not what it used to be. My grandpa used to sing that song, The Old Gray Mare. She's not what she used to be, and neither am I. And I never had any idea what that song was about until I started getting a little bit older, and now I understand what my grandpa was singing about here. The outward man is perishing. I can see it every day when I look in the mirror. I can feel it every morning when I get up and put my feet on the floor. I can tell the outward man is perishing, but the inward man is renewed day by day. Paul says our affliction, it's light and momentary, but our glory is an eternal weight. See the contrast there between light and momentary and eternal weight? What's seen is temporary. What's unseen is eternal. Those are all these, that's 9 contrasts I listed there that Paul gives in this section of Scripture here. Now, he had plenty of negative things to focus on if he wanted to do that. And probably you know some people who are like that they just always focus on the negative. They never can see anything good. They've always, we call them Debbie Downers sometime, and they have a way of just taking the air out of everybody's balloon, and they can always see the negative side of things. Paul had lots of things that were negative that he could have focused on. Sometimes those people, when you see them, you say, how are things going for you? Well, I got to tell you. And then they got a whole list of all these bad, horrible things that have happened to them in the past since you've seen them last, whether it's a week, whether it's a month, whatever. They've got all these problems. I remember one guy, I asked him on a Sunday morning one time, I said, how are you doing? He says, well, now you either want me to complain or you want me to lie. Which is it? Well, you know what? I think if we just give it a little bit of thought and we think about what the Lord has done for us, maybe we can think of some good things that we've got to say. Maybe there's some positive things that are going on with us. I know other people that we ask them on a Sunday morning, how are you doing? And almost out of reflex, they'll say, I'm doing really, really good. And sometimes they'll stop themselves and say, well, actually, if the truth be told, I'm a little under the weather today. But just by out of habit, because they're positive people, they're always talking about the good things that are happening in life. And we all have positive and negative things in our life, and we get to choose which ones we're going to focus on. Paul focused on the positive here. The Lord had said to Paul when he was Saul, when he went by the name of Saul, he said to him, you're going to suffer many things for my name's sake. He told him that. Right off the bat, he's in Damascus, and they plotted to kill him. They drove him out of Antioch. I'm just taking a quick walk through the book of Acts of all these things that happened. These are just the things that are recorded in the book of Acts. We know from what Paul talks about later in this book that there's a lot of bad things that happened to Paul that aren't recorded in the book of Acts. But just the ones that are. They plotted to kill him in Damascus. Remember, he had to be led over the wall in a basket by night. Had to kind of sneak out of town. They drove him out of Antioch. They tried to stone him at Iconium. At Lystra, they did stone him and left him for dead. It always amazes me when he came to, he goes back into the town. That really, I think, took some guts, but that's what he did. When he got to Philippi, they beat him with rods and they put him in stocks in the inner prison. In Thessalonica, he had to flee from a mob at night. In Berea, they drove him out there. In fact, the people at Thessalonica that were so upset with him, they followed him to Berea and stirred up trouble there. And that happened to Paul multiple times. At Corinth, they plotted against him and brought him in front of the leadership there, the secular leadership. They almost killed him at Ephesus, and they plotted his death at Corinth later on in Acts chapter 20. They wanted to kill him at Jerusalem. If it hadn't been for the Roman army, they probably would have. There was a time in Acts chapter 23 you can read about where more than 40 men vowed that they would not eat again until they had killed Paul. By the way, Paul lived for quite a while after that. I often wonder what happened to these 40 men, whether they broke their vow or whether they starved to death. They had to do one of those two things. Paul was in prison for at least 4 years altogether in all the times that he was in prison. But on top of that, there were the beatings and the shipwrecks and the things that aren't even recorded for us. And at the end of this book, in chapter 11, Paul lists a bunch of those things. And he just kind of lists them off in very short order, in very quick fashion, and without going into all the details. And we know that a lot of those things are not even recorded in the book of Acts, so we don't know very much about them. But my point is that Paul had a lot of bad things happen to him, and he was finally executed at Rome. Now, he anticipates that when he writes the letter of 2 Timothy. He's expecting to be killed there at Rome, and he knows that's coming, and that's how he died. So, Paul had a lot to complain about if that's what he wanted to do. If he wanted to focus on the negative things, he had a whole laundry list of negative things to focus on. But he didn't do that. Paul was not one to focus on the negative. When he was in prison in Philippi, after they beat him with the rods and they put him in stocks and they put him down in the inner prison, he and Silas are there. What are they doing? They're singing hymns and praying and praising God. And after regaining consciousness outside of Lystra, I mentioned this already, he goes back into the city. They think he's dead. They've been stoning him. They think he's dead. When he comes back to consciousness, he gets up and goes back in the city. The reality is that most things in life are not either good or bad in isolation. Most things in life are a mixed bag. We recently, not that long ago, about a month and a half ago, we started a new year, the year 2022. And some people have the idea 2022 is just going to be absolutely great. Some people have the idea, 2022 is going to be horrible. The reality is 2022 for most of us is going to be a mixed bag. There's going to be some very good things that happen to us, some very bad things that happen to us. A few years ago, right at the end of the year, I think it might have been about 2019, right towards the end of the year, on the morning news program, somebody asked the question, what day from the past year would you want to relive? And I got thinking about that. I thought it was a very thought-provoking question. I got thinking about that, and I was having a hard time coming up with a particular day that I would want to relive of that previous year if I had to just pick one. And part of the reason it was so difficult is because most days are a mixed bag. There's some good things that happen in that day and some not so good things that happen in that day. Now, some days are better than others, but nevertheless, every given day, there's good things to focus on if you look for them. There's bad things to focus on if you look for them. The question is, which one are you going to focus on? Now, remember again, Paul's still talking about why he doesn't lose heart. And all these horrible things that have happened to Paul, one of the reasons he doesn't lose heart is because he focused on positive things. And it makes all the difference in the world whether you focus on the positive or whether you focus on the negative. And that's not just true of our future. It's true of our present. Right? At any given moment, we can focus on the positive or we can focus on the negative. The last video I did, I had forgotten to turn my phone off. You saw it. My phone rang right in the middle of the lecture as I'm trying to record it. A couple times I had a hard time finding my word. And it's real easy for me to find fault with that and say, I don't even want to put that on YouTube. Well, that's focusing on the negative. Or I can focus on the positive and say, well, I did say some good things in there that somebody else might need to hear. And so we have to think about that in the present. We have to think about it when we look towards the future. If we're going to focus on the positive and all the horrible things that could happen to us tomorrow. I'm not saying you don't plan for things, but you also ought to focus on the positive. I'm making these videos because we got a storm that's supposed to be coming in any time now. It's supposed to switch over from rain to ice and snow. Now, I could sit here and be all worried about how bad it's going to be to drive home whenever I finish doing these videos. That's focusing on the negative. Or I can say, aren't I grateful that I got these videos done ahead of time and I can actually spend the evening at home with my wife? That's a real positive. And so it's all, but I want to say this before I leave this behind, and that is, it's also true of the past. There are a lot of people who are caught up in the negative things that happened to them in the past. And sometimes they can't get past them and they can't let go of them and they can't forget about them and they can't even talk about the past and have anything good to say about it whatsoever. And then there's other people, if you ask them about the past, how was your life in high school? I had so much fun in high school. And they start telling you all these stories. And if they think about it long enough, they remember that there were also some things that happened to them in high school that weren't so pleasant. That's true of most of us. But they choose not to focus on those things. They focus on the positive things. And I just want to tell you that whether you're talking about the past or whether you're talking about the present or whether you're talking about the future, it makes all the difference in the world whether you're focusing on the positive things or whether you're focusing on the negative things. And certainly if you focus on the negative things, you can very quickly lose heart. The second thing is, Paul focused on others. When you get to verse 12, Paul keeps talking about these things that have happened unto him. He says, like for example, we're hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. And he keeps saying we and so on. But he gets to verse 12, he says, so then death is working in us. And you almost expect that verse to end by saying, but life in us. But he doesn't. He says, but life in you. And the point Paul is making here is, even though all these horrible things are happening to us, meaning Paul, in the editorial sense there, life is working in you, because that's why we're suffering these things, so that life can work for you. And so Paul's focus is on them. Verse 14, he says, God will raise us up and present us with you. In verse 15, he says, all things are for your sake. And so he says that grace having spread through the many may cause thanksgiving to abound to the glory of God. And so when you're going through troubles, it's pretty easy to focus on yourself. Very easy to do that. And a lot of us are guilty of doing that. And I guarantee at times I've been guilty of it. But if you just focus on yourself, things only tend to get worse. And especially when you're going on through troubles, it's easy to get this idea, well, I'm going through all this trouble and nobody else is paying attention to me at all. They're not focusing on me. And it's easy to have that attitude, well, hold on a minute. What about me? I'm suffering here. I'm going through difficult things. Why isn't anybody paying attention to the bad things that are happening to me? But Paul didn't do anything like that here. He didn't say to the Corinthians, you know what, you guys, you think you got it bad? What about all the bad things that have happened to me? He doesn't say that. He focused on the Corinthians, not himself. He said, look, we're able to go through all these difficult things and look at the positive side, because it's not about us, it's about you. Now earlier we said it's about God, and of course ultimately it is, but the point I'm making is that Paul says it's for your benefit that we're doing this service for God, so that you can benefit, so that you can have salvation, so that you can glorify God. That's what he's saying there in verse 15 here. You all have heard the saying, and I don't know who originated it, but I was sad because I had no shoes until I saw a man with no feet. There's a great deal of truth in that. The point is that there's always somebody who has things worse than you. You all know those people. I've known them before. My wife and I used to work with somebody. It doesn't matter what kind of problem you had. They had it worse. Twice. And they had it way worse than you, and they had it twice. And they always had to one-up you on those things. But the reality is, I don't care what your situation is, there's always somebody who legitimately has it worse than you. And there's really no better way to forget your own troubles than helping other people with theirs. Number one, it puts your own problems into perspective. I thought my problems were bad until I started helping these people and I realized how bad their situation was. Secondly, it gets you doing something useful and productive, and that always helps you, makes you feel better about things. And thirdly, it helps you to forget about your own issues, because you're focused on other people instead of focused on yourself. One of the reasons we have so much depression in our society is that we're so focused on ourselves instead of other people. What can I, what's better for me? What are my problems? What are my issues? Instead of focusing on other people and what can I do for them? And one of the reasons we have so much dissatisfaction in the church is that we focus too much on ourselves instead of others. And this goes back to what I was saying, I think, in the first lecture here today, that a lot of the church fights are all because we make it all about us and what we want. And we focus, well, that's not the style of music I like. Well, that's not the kind of preaching I like. Well, that's not the kind of that's not the color I like for the carpet. That's not the, that's not the way I want things to be. And that's not the way I would choose for things to go. And we just focus so much attention on ourselves instead of the people around us and what they might need and what they might want. And then there's the focus on the inward man. Paul contrasts the inward and the outward man in verse 16, where he says, we don't lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. The outward man is perishing. And as I said, all you got to do to verify that is look in the mirror every day. In fact, better yet, look at some old photos. You don't realize how much you're aging until you look at an old photo and you realize, wow, time is taking a toll on me. Some days all it takes is getting out of bed and putting your feet on the floor. Go to the doctor's office or the hospital, and you start to realize that your outward man is perishing. Every time I go to the doctor, it seems like the doctor's convinced that I'm going to die soon. And I'm not always so convinced of that, although sometimes I have different doctors that aren't so pessimistic about it. I want a doctor to be honest with me, but I like it if they have a little bit of, if they're not I like it if they're more of an optimist than a pessimist. But, all you have to do really to know that the outward man is perishing is come to Wednesday night prayer service and listen to the prayer request. And it's not just you, but all around you, the outward man is perishing. And it's true of everybody. The evidence is overwhelming. It's undeniable. It's everywhere. The inward man, however, Paul says, and he's talking about a Christian here, is being renewed day by day. And after all, isn't that what really counts? The outward man is destined to die. I told my doctor that one time. The doctor says, if you don't make radical changes, you are going to die, soon. I don't know what she meant by soon, but that was five plus years ago. And I said, maybe longer than that, and I said, I recognize I'm going to die. Eventually, I'm going to die. I've come to terms with that. Lord and I have dealt with that issue. We know that's going to happen. But I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is never having lived and not accomplishing anything while I am alive. And so I'm not going to spend all my waking hours focused on trying to live longer and then not accomplish anything. While I'm here, however long I'm going to live, I want to accomplish something. I want to get something done specifically for the Lord. The outward man's destined to die, but the inward man is destined to live eternally somewhere, either in heaven or in hell. The inward man is going to live eternally somewhere. I don't know about you, but I care a great deal about which somewhere I end up in. And so that's where my focus needs to be. It's up to us to make that decision. In other words, by how we live. It's not like God's going to say, well, you want to go to heaven or you want to go to hell, but it's how we live every day that decides where that's going to be. Are we going to follow the Lord or are we going to do our own thing? How foolish is it to focus on what is destined to fall apart and die? Now look what 1 Peter says in 1 Peter 3 and 4. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. Listen to what he says. He says, do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. I'm going to talk about the ladies here for just a minute because they probably, not that men don't do this, but women probably more so. Sometimes we put an awful lot of effort into how our body looks on the outside, our face and our body and how we look. Eventually that's all going to fall apart. And eventually that's all going to die. How foolish is it to put all our efforts into that? Instead, we can focus on what's going to live eternally, and that's the inward man, and that can be renewed day by day. That requires, by the way, our inward man actually requires daily attention. If the inward man's going to be renewed day by day, we have to pay attention to it day by day. Just like if the outward man is going to be renewed day by day, we got to pay attention to it day by day. But even if we do that, the outward man's still going to perish. All you have to do is look at the aging actresses and the aging models, and you see that that's true. Or how about the aging bodybuilders or the aging athletes? And you realize that all that focus on the outward, it's just temporary. But if we put a daily focus on the inward man, our inward man can be renewed day by day, and it is worth that. Which brings us to the next focus, and that is the eternal. And we'll start on that when we come back from our little break here.